"No," Carlos Santana said, pushing the demo tape back across the table toward Clive Davis. "This isn't my music. This is pop. This is commercial. This isn't what I do." Clive Davis, the legendary music executive who'd discovered Janis Joplin and signed Bruce Springsteen, looked at Carlos like he was insane. "Carlos, this song is called Smooth. It's going to be the biggest hit of your career. Trust me." Carlos shook his head. "I said no. That was 1998. The song Santana refused would go on to win him 8 Grammy Awards, sell 30 million copies, and become the second most successful song of all time. But first, he had to say yes. By 1998, Carlos Santana was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that makes headlines, but the quiet, career-ending kind that happens when the music industry moves on without you. He was 51 years old. His last hit had been in 1982. Radio stations had stopped playing his music. Record stores had moved his albums to the bargain bin, and his record label was losing patience. Carlos wasn't broke, but he was becoming irrelevant. And in the music business, irrelevance is worse than poverty. You can come back from being poor. It's much harder to come back from being forgotten. That's when Clive Davis called. Clive Davis was a legend in the music industry, the man with the golden ear who discovered and shaped some of the biggest careers in music history. If Clive Davis wanted to work with you, you didn't say no, unless you were Carlos Santana. "I have an idea," Clive said during their first meeting. "I want to make an album that brings you back, but we're going to do it my way. We're going to pair you with contemporary artists. We're going to make songs that radio will play. We're going to make you relevant again." Carlos was skeptical. For nearly 30 years, he'd done things his own way. Spiritual music, Latin rock fusion, albums that critics loved but radio ignored. The idea of making commercial music felt like selling out. "I don't know, Clive," Carlos said. "I'm not interested in chasing hits. I make music for the soul, not for the radio." "I'm not asking you to sell out," Clive said patiently. "I'm asking you to reach people. There's a whole generation that doesn't know who Carlos Santana is. Let's introduce them to your guitar. Let's remind the world why you're a legend." Carlos reluctantly agreed to explore the idea, but he set boundaries. "I'm not doing anything that compromises my artistic integrity. I'm not making bubblegum pop. I'm not pretending to be 25. I wouldn't ask you to," Clive assured him. "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." Over the next few months, Clive assembled an impressive roster of collaborations. Dave Matthews, Lauryn Hill, Eric Clapton. Each pairing was designed to blend Santana's legendary guitar with contemporary voices that dominated radio. Carlos was cautiously optimistic about some of the collaborations, but then Clive played him a demo of a song called Smooth. The moment Carlos heard it, he hated it. The Latin-influenced pop-rock melody felt too slick, too polished, too commercial, and the artist Clive wanted to pair him with Rob Thomas from Matchbox 20, represented everything Carlos thought was wrong with mainstream rock. "No," Carlos said flatly. "Absolutely not. This is not my style. This sounds like something for Ricky Martin or Enrique Iglesias, not for Carlos Santana." Clive tried to explain his vision. "That's exactly the point. This song takes the Latin influences you've always championed and makes them accessible to pop radio. And Rob Thomas, his voice on your guitar, that's magic. Trust me." I said, "No, Clive. Find a different song." But Clive Davis didn't get to where he was by giving up easily. Over the next several weeks, he kept bringing Smooth back up. He played Carlos different versions. He explained the arrangement possibilities. He talked about radio potential and chart performance, and Grammy opportunities. And every single time, Carlos said no. The song was too commercial, too pop, too far from his artistic vision. He'd spent 3 decades building a reputation as a serious musician, a spiritual artist. He wasn't going to throw that away for a 3-minute pop song, no matter how catchy it was. Carlos's wife, Deborah, watched these negotiations with growing concern. She could see what Carlos couldn't, or wouldn't. Her husband's career was slipping away. The music industry had moved on. If Carlos didn't find a way to connect with contemporary audiences, he might never get another chance. "You're being stubborn," she told him one night, after yet another conference call with Clive where Carlos had refused smooth again. "I'm being true to myself," Carlos insisted. "I didn't become Carlos Santana by following trends or chasing hits. I became Carlos Santana by doing music that meant something to me." "And that's beautiful," Deborah said. "But Carlos, nobody's listening anymore. You can make the most meaningful music in the world, but if nobody hears it, what's the point? So you think I should sell out? Just do whatever Clive Davis tells me, because he promises it'll be a hit. I think you should trust the man who's made more hits than almost anyone in the history of recorded music. I think you should consider that maybe, just maybe, you can reach people and still be true to yourself. This doesn't have to be either or." Carlos shook his head. "You don't understand. Smooth isn't me. It's not my sound. It's not my message. Have you actually listened to it?" Deborah challenged. "Really listened? Or have you just decided it's commercial and shut your mind?" That question stung because Carlos knew she was right. He'd been so defensive about maintaining his artistic purity that he hadn't actually given Smooth a fair chance. He'd heard it was pop, and he'd immediately rejected it. So that night, alone in his home studio, Carlos put on the Smooth demo again. This time, he didn't listen as Carlos Santana, the artistic purist. He listened as a musician. And something shifted. The melody was catchy, yes, but it was also sophisticated. The Latin percussion elements were authentic, not token. And the space for guitar solo. His guitar solo had real potential. He could do something interesting there, something that honored his roots while reaching new ears, but he still wasn't convinced. The next day, he called Clive. "I listened to Smooth again. It's better than I remembered, but I still don't think it's right for me." Clive was silent for a moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "Carlos, I'm going to be honest with you. This is your last chance. Your label is ready to drop you. Radio won't play you. You can keep making music for yourself, and that's fine. But if you want to reach people, if you want to remind the world why you're one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, this is how you do it." The Smooth isn't selling out. It's reaching out. That night, Carlos and Deborah had a long conversation. She was gentle but firm. "I love your integrity. I love that you care about your art. But baby, stubbornness isn't the same as integrity. You can do this song and still be Carlos Santana. In fact, you can make this song more Carlos Santana than anyone expects." Carlos thought about Woodstock, when Bill Graham had pushed him to perform despite his fears. He thought about his spiritual teacher Sri Chinmoy, who taught him that ego was the enemy of true service. And he realized that his refusal of Smooth wasn't about artistic integrity, it was about ego. He was afraid of being seen as commercial, afraid of what the jazz purists would say, afraid of not being taken seriously. The next day, Carlos called Clive. "Okay, I'll do Smooth, but I'm going to make it mine. I'm going to play that guitar solo like it's the most important solo of my career." Clive laughed with relief. "Carlos, that's all I've ever wanted. Make it yours." The recording session for Smooth was transformative. Rob Thomas came in to record vocals, and Carlos was surprised by how much he liked working with him. Rob's voice had a rawness, a soul that Carlos hadn't expected from a pop-rock singer. And when it came time to record the guitar solo, Carlos poured everything into it. All his years of experience, all his spiritual practice, all his signature tone and technique. When he finished the solo, everyone in the studio knew something special had happened. That wasn't a commercial guitar solo. That was Carlos Santana, showing the world he was still one of the greatest to ever pick up the instrument. Supernatural, the album featuring Smooth, was released in June 1999. The label and Clive had high hopes, but nobody predicted what happened next. Smooth exploded. It didn't just become a hit, it became a cultural phenomenon. It topped charts around the world. It played on every radio station. It became inescapable. And Carlos Santana, the 52-year-old guitarist who'd been written off as a has-been, was suddenly the biggest thing in music. Kids who'd never heard of Santana before were buying the album. Radio stations that hadn't played him in 15 years were putting him in rotation. He was selling out arenas again. But the real validation came on February 23, 2000, at the 42nd Annual Grammy Awards. Supernatural was nominated in multiple categories. Smooth was up for Record of the Year and Song of the Year. Carlos knew he'd probably win something, but he had no idea what was about to happen. That night, Carlos Santana won 8 Grammy Awards. 8. He tied Michael Jackson's record for most Grammys won in a single night. He won Album of the Year, Record of the Year, Song of the Year, Best Pop Performance, Best Rock Album, and more. By the end of the night, Carlos was standing on stage with arms full of golden gramophones, tears running down his face, barely able to believe what was happening. Smooth, the song he'd refused multiple times, had won him the biggest night of his career. The song he'd thought was too commercial had reminded the world why he mattered. The song he'd almost said no to had saved his career. In his acceptance speech, Carlos was gracious and grateful, but privately, he was thinking about all those times he'd said no to Clive Davis. All those times he'd pushed the demo tape back across the table. All those times his ego had nearly cost him everything. "I was wrong," Carlos told Deborah that night after the ceremony, surrounded by his 8 Grammy Awards. "I was so wrong. If you hadn't pushed me, if Clive hadn't been persistent, if I'd stuck to my stubborn refusal, none of this would have happened." Deborah smiled. "You weren't wrong about protecting your art. You were just wrong about what would compromise it. This move didn't make you less Carlos Santana. It made more people aware of who Carlos Santana is." Carlos would later reflect on the Smooth experience as one of the most important lessons of his career. "I almost said no to the biggest opportunity of my life because I was afraid," he admitted in interviews. "Afraid of being commercial, afraid of what people would think, afraid of stepping outside my comfort zone. But sometimes the things we resist the most are exactly what we need." The success of Supernatural and Smooth didn't just revive Carlos's career, it transformed it. Suddenly, he was playing for 3 generations. The fans who'd loved him since Woodstock, their children who'd forgotten about him, and their grandchildren who were discovering him for the first time. The album sold over 30 million copies worldwide. Smooth became the second most successful song of all time on Billboard's rankings. And all of it almost didn't happen because Carlos Santana said no. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. Because he thought he knew better. Because he thought commercial success meant artistic compromise. Because he let his ego convince him that reaching people was the same as selling out. Years later, Clive Davis would write about the experience in his memoir. Carlos Santana is one of the most talented musicians I've ever worked with, Clive wrote. But he's also one of the most stubborn. Getting him to record smooth was like pulling teeth. He fought me every step of the way. But in the end, I think even Carlos would admit that sometimes you have to get out of your own way and trust that reaching people doesn't diminish your art. It amplifies it. The Carlos, reading those words, could only nod in agreement, because the song he refused, the song he thought would compromise his integrity, the song he almost walked away from, that song didn't make him less of an artist. It made him accessible to millions of people who needed to hear his guitar. It brought his music to a generation that might never have discovered him otherwise. And it proved that commercial success and artistic integrity aren't opposites. They're partners, if you're brave enough to let them work together. If this story of how stubbornness almost cost a legend his greatest triumph moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who's ever been too proud to accept help, too stubborn to see an opportunity, or too afraid of success to reach for it. Have you ever said no to something that turned out to be exactly what you needed? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the moments when music legends had to save themselves from their own worst instincts.